Imagine being inside a fortified shelter deep under the surface, safe, soundproofed, and still. The faint echoes you hear are just machinery, distant and reliable. You're in the safest part of the base, the part built for rest. Tonight's story moves with slow, tactical clarity, guiding you gently into sleep. The night has taken on a soft, tactical calm. Our story begins within that atmosphere, slow, grounded, steady. Let's enter it. I always forget how it started until I remember the water, not the war. That it started with briefings and maps and orbital insertion paths traced in blue across hologlass. The war had a beginning you could mark in a log. What happened here did not. It was just another shift, another artificial dawn under plastic sky, and the sound of the pipe racks above my bunk ticking as the temperature cycled. The water was recycled. Everything on Keth 9 was recycled. Air, water, heat, people. Once you were no longer useful, they recycled you out system to nowhere. I was one transfer away from that when it happened. The alarm for morning came through the bunk rail as a short vibration instead of a tone. Someone in maintenance had rerouted sound to save a fraction of power. Old habit kicked in before thought. I rolled out, put my feet exactly where I always put them, avoiding the hairline crack in the deck plating that could catch a bare toe. My hands found the work suit by reflex, skin sliding into cold fabric lined with worn exomesh. The servos in the knees groaned when I flexed. They sounded like old men. I logged in at the maintenance console outside the barracks, palm to plate, retina to lens. The system greeted me with my name and a red tag listing disciplinary penalty hours still owed. It did not greet me with rank. That had been stripped 3 transports ago. The day's assignment came up. Under Iceline 7, flow irregularities, identify and address, report any structural vibrations above level 3. It was the kind of task you gave to someone whose file scared you, but whose contract still had time on it. I ate in the mess, same as any other day, paste warmed in metal trays, fluids in squeeze packs. The men and women at the tables avoided my bench, not openly, just by habit. A shift boss named Mero sat 2 seats down and pretended not to look at the scars on my hands when I peeled back the foil on the nutrient block. The feed screens on the far wall showed storm patterns over the gas giant below us. Pale bands of methane and ammonia swirled in silence. You could watch them for hours and never see the same pattern twice. The colony AI overlaid weather advisories and energy price updates. Nothing about wars. That was for other channels, on other worlds. It would have stayed that way, just another shift, if not for the argument over a toolbox. In the equipment bay, the standard line kit I needed was missing from its slot. Not misplaced, signed out. The log showed a junior tech from night shift had taken it and not returned it. I paged him once, got nothing. His suit tag showed off duty, inside a dome. I went to Mero and asked for override clearance to take another kit. He barely looked up from his slate. Use something else, Rollin. The rank had been gone long enough that I barely reacted to the sound of my own surname. I told him the line spec called for that exact configuration, that the backup kit was flagged for calibration, that he could either sign the override or log the delay himself. He did not like that. Men like Mero did not like being forced to see that they mattered in the system. If he approved the override and something failed, his name was in the chain. If he refused and production dropped, his name was still in the chain. Either way, it meant responsibility. He gestured at me with the slate, eyes small and tired. Maybe you're not the right fit for Line 7 anymore, Kade. Security's been wanting a word with you anyway. That was how it started. Not with a shot, with a petty man looking for a way to move a problem off his balance sheet. Security met me halfway between the bay and the lift. 2 of them in gray exo plates with company crest on the pauldrons. Light carbines mag-clipped to their chests, sidearms on hips, shock batons folded along their thighs. Behind mirrored visors, they were just shapes. They said I was to report to processing, evaluation, potential transfer to a more suitable facility. They did not need dialogue to say it. The orders came over the shared channel, text overlay in the corner of my HUD, signed by Sector Oversight. I considered refusing. Then I remembered the clause in my contract about compliance and the way non-compliance charges stacked into extension years. I had thought I was done with forced service. I was wrong. So I walked. We moved through the main artery of Dome 2, past workers hustling to their sections, past the vending wall and the medbay doors. People stepped aside for the security exosuits without looking. That was the thing about these domes. It was never quiet, but it was always blind. Every noise had a function. Every person tried not to see how the system kept functioning. I watched the security pair instead. Weight distribution in their step, battery pack sitting a little too low on their backs. One helmet visor slightly scuffed on the right side, indicating a habit of leaning against bulkheads. Carbines set to non-lethal stun by the ring color at the muzzle. No grenades that I could see. They were used to crowd control, not war. Standard escort procedure put one man half a pace ahead and to the left, the other 2 paces behind and right. It was not a formation designed for someone like me. It was designed for unarmed workers who knew little about angles and momentum. We reached processing at the edge of the dome, marked by a simple sign and a double hatch with yellow hazard striping. Beyond it lay the decontamination tunnel and the intake rooms, the places where new arrivals were scrubbed and scanned and sorted into labor categories. I had come through that tunnel once, a long time ago, still shaking from drop pod re-entry, still smelling the polymers of a fresh uniform. I had not understood then that this was just another front. The inner hatch opened with a hiss. A wash of bright white light poured out, too bright for dome standard. I felt my vision tighten at the edges, like it always did when the world went white. The smell of sterilizing agents hit next, sharp and chemical, overlaying the usual recycled air tang. They told me, through another text overlay, to step inside and strip to base layer. The decon jets would handle the rest. I stepped forward. The floor grating under my boots was metal mesh slightly flexing, with drainage channels running toward a central outlet. Nozzles lined the walls, small and round and dark. Above, in the corners, the dull eyes of cameras watched. A frame in the center of the room held restraint bands, retracted at the moment. On a panel nearby, someone had written a joke in marker and scratched it out. The letters were still there underneath. My breathing slowed, not from calm, from something else. There had been another room once. Different walls, different nozzles, different language on the signs. But the frame was the same, the bands were the same, the camera lenses had the same blind sheen. Water had fallen in that room too, thick with chemicals, hot and cold and sudden shocks. Men had stood around me with masks and gloves, speaking in tones that took no notice of the shaking in my legs. One of the security troopers stepped behind me, heavy hand on my shoulder. The other moved to the panel. I heard the click of the restraints powering, tiny servos, a whine as the bands extended from the frame. The light grew sharper. The room narrowed until all I could see was the arc of steel in front of me, my muscles locked and unlocked in useless microspasms. Someone's hand, gloved, solid, pushed against the back of my neck, guiding me toward the frame. The first time I had been unarmed. This time, my right wrist still held my maintenance tool, the compact, dull gray multi-cutter they issued to techs who had to strip casing bolts in awkward spaces. It rode in a magnet clip under my sleeve, forgotten by the men who had scanned me at the hatch. Their detectors saw preset weapon signatures. They did not ping tools. The water hit, freezing at first, then searing hot, a shock that blew open the wall in my head between now and then. In the flash of sensation, The years folded. The room dissolved and reformed as another room, another world. I heard again the distant whine of a dropship taking off without me. I saw again the dark outline of a man with a hose and a cattle prod. The words he had spoken once came back without meaning, only rhythm. Something old and hard slid into place inside me, like a locking bolt cycling home. I moved. There is nothing elegant about close work, no cinematic grace. It is about joints, levers, angles. The man's hand on my neck became an anchor point. I rotated under it, dropping my center of mass, driving my shoulder into his hip. The multi-cutter cleared the sleeve with a practiced twist of my palm. The first cut went into the weaker joint in his suit at the back of the knee. Synthetic fibers parted under the tool's focused edge, exposing inner actuators. His leg buckled. My shoulder kept moving, turning his fall into a spin. His head hit the frame with a hollow sound. The second trooper started to raise his carbine. At this range, in decon protocols, it would be set to low stun to avoid damaging equipment. He did not get a chance to adjust. I drove the multi-cutter into the exposed gap between his chest plate and underarm as he pivoted. The angle was bad. The cutter hit ceramic first, then found softer material behind. His suit jerked. The carbine discharged once into the ceiling, sending a spray of sparks and a puff of vaporized insulation into the air. None of it felt like a decision. It was all vector and timing, learned in corridors full of dust and screaming years before this dome was even built. Both men went down hard. Alarms started in the corridor outside. The decon nozzles shut off, leaving the room stinking of chemicals and burned plastic. I should have stopped then. Raised my hands, stepped back, tried to talk. That is what a sane man in a civilian facility would have done. I stepped over the first trooper instead, peeled his sidearm from its holster, and moved toward the maintenance hatch I knew had to be here. Intake rooms always had at least one. The system did not care about men. It cared about access. The hatch was behind a panel marked Utilities. 4 screws, quick work for the cutter. I slid through into the dark and pulled the panel back into place behind me. In the narrow maintenance duct, the noise of the alarms became a muffled throb. Emergency lights painted the world in intermittent red. My suit dripped decon fluid, cooling rapidly against my skin. I crawled. Maintenance conduits in Cas9 ran like capillaries behind every wall. I had spent months inside them, fixing leaks and clearing blockages. The layout of the dome was mapped into muscle memory. I moved by feel as much as sight, counting junctions, orienting myself by the faint vibration of pumps and the direction of airflow on my face. Behind the walls, the colony sounded different, less human, more honest. The first security drone rolled past above me a few minutes later. I heard it in the duct as a ticking vibration and a faint whine. It would be deploying in the corridor I had just left, little track sphere with cameras and stun charge. They would find the 2 men on the floor. They would read their vitals. They would classify the incident as assault or attempted murder, depending on what the medics could salvage. My status in the system would change from worker, discipline risk, to active hostile. It did not matter what I felt about it. I had already crossed the line, somewhere between the first cut and the hatch. I kept moving until the duct opened into a vertical shaft leading down toward the under-ice levels. Cold rolled up from below, carrying the faint scent of hydrocarbons and oil. This was where the colony's veins ran, pumping frozen fuel out of the crust. I clipped the stolen sidearm to my suit and started down the ladder. The deeper levels were darker and louder. Pipes as thick as freight carriages ran along the walls, flexing as pressure changed. Condensation froze in delicate patterns on exposed metal. Every sound carried strangely, the thump of compressors, the hiss of valves, the distant boom of something heavy engaging far below. I reached Service Junction C, a cross node where 4 main lines met, and paused in the shadow of a monitoring station. My HUD pinged as it caught a trace of security traffic bleeding through the metal. They were sealing dome sections, setting checkpoints, pulling personnel rosters. My name floated in the feed like debris. They would guess I had gone into the maintenance grid. It was the only place I knew well enough to vanish. I did not intend to vanish. Running bought you time, not outcomes. Outcomes came from structure. I started mapping in my head. Dome 2, processing at the edge. Under ice line, 7 scheduled for inspection. Methane pocket flags in sectors L and M. Known weak points in the old piping where ice shifts had stressed joints. Flow regulators whose failure would trigger automatic shutdowns. Security would treat this like a manhunt. They would move in squads along main routes, supported by drones, eyes fixed on tracking my ID tag. They would not think to look at the way the colony breezed. Above me, heavy boots clanged into a corridor, accompanied by the softer hum of exoplates. Radio chatter filtered faintly through the bulkhead. Confirmation of an assault. Evasive suspect. Authorization for escalated force. At least 3 men from the pattern of steps, likely 4, short, impatient strides, carbines out, helmets sealed. They were between me and the quickest route deeper. I could have gone another way, adding minutes to the separation. But time cut both ways. The longer they had, the more resources they could bring in. The more they could turn this place into a cage, not a maze. I moved toward them instead. In war, you learn that terrain is not just hills and streets. Terrain is also habit, protocol, expectation. They would not expect an unarmored maintenance tech to push toward them, so their eyes would be out, their rifles angled for forward threat. Their spacing would be sloppy for rear defense. I found the access hatch that opened into their corridor, counted 3 breaths to steady the tremor in my hands, and kicked it out. The panel flew into the corridor with a shriek of torn fasteners. In the moment of noise, I was already moving through the gap. The first man had his back to me. I saw the pattern of his plates, the slight flare where the back segment met the lower armor. My sidearm was already up. I put 1 round into that seam. The recoil was sharp and efficient, the report swallowed by the corridor walls. He went down like someone had cut a string. His partner turned, too slow, instinctively stepping toward his fallen comrade instead of away. Training difference. They were used to workers snapping, grabbing tools, having to be put down with non-lethal rounds. They were not used to someone who knew what a seam meant. I shot him in the visor. The reinforced composite spider-webbed, then cracked inward. He dropped, hands clawing at his helmet as if he could pull the damage off. The third man, further down the corridor, managed to dive toward the nearest doorframe, seeking cover in line of fire. His reflexes were closer to what I knew. He fired as he moved. Stun pulse sizzled down the corridor, close enough that my HUD flashed a warning. I hit the deck, rolling into the shadow of a wall console, let his shot burn itself into a panel. The smell of ionized air filled my helmet. We traded angles and silence. He had better armor and weapons. I had better sense of pressure, of the subtle vibrations beneath the floor and behind the walls. There was a junction box 2 meters above his head feeding into the lighting and sensor grid. I had worked on it last week. It had a manual override lever. I slid my multi-cutter under the panel at my back, cut 2 quick strokes through the casing, and reached blind into the tangle of cables and metal. The current bit at my gloves like teeth. My fingers found the lever just as his next shot scorched the wall closer to my face. I pulled. The lights went out in the corridor. The HUD dimmed, switching to passive. For a moment there was only dark, dense, and thick. Then my suit's low-light sensors kicked in, rendering the world in green outlines. His exoplates reflected more than the walls. I saw the line of his limb, the tilt of his helmet as he tried to track movement he could not see. In that half-second of hesitation, I was already moving sideways, hugging the ceiling with my weight stretched flat along the wall, using the exomesh in my suit to hold, ignoring the flare of pain in my leg. I dropped behind him and fired once at the back of his hip joint. The armor there was thicker, but everything had a limit. The round punched through, spun him sideways. His own momentum carried him into the wall. The carbine clanged to the floor. When it was over, the corridor smelled of burned insulation and melted composite. 3 men lay in varying states of stillness. My breath rasped in my own ears. My heart rate was high, but not as high as the first kill I had ever made. Experience flattens the peaks. I scavenged what I could. Extra magazines, a single fragmentation charge from a belt pouch. One of them had a sensor jammer patch, small and dirty, likely used to cheat patrol logs. I slapped it onto my chest plate, watched the HUD flicker as my ID tag blurred. Then I left them where they fell and slid back into the maintenance grid. I do not know exactly when the off-world contractors arrived. I only know when everything changed. Until then, security had been reactive and clumsy. They flooded corridors with bodies and drones, sealed hatches, yelled into radios. My HUD caught fragments of their chatter carried through metal, anger, fear, the edge of disbelief. After the explosion in Junction L, their tone shifted. Junction L was not supposed to explode. It was marked in my internal map as high risk because of methane pockets behind the old rockcrete layers. Flow regulators there were touchy, prone to pressure spikes. That was why they sent me to check Line 7 in the first place. The system had been complaining about stress for days, but production targets meant patches instead of replacements. I had meant to use that. The plan was simple. Overstress the line just enough to trigger automatic safety valves. Those would slam shut, halt extraction on that branch, and force a system-wide recalibration. In the confusion, I could move through otherwise restricted areas. Lock watchers would be overwhelmed by cascading alerts. The theory was sound. The practice involved a rusted manual override wheel and a corroded pressure gauge lying to both of us. I cranked the wheel 3 turns. The gauge needle crept into the yellow. Somewhere deep in the walls, valves started to vibrate. Then, something cracked. It could have been an old weld giving way or a micro-quake flexing the ice. It could have been a flaw in the original casting no one had ever seen. The cause did not matter. The effect did. The line ruptured. Raw methane roared into the tunnel, displacing air with invisible force. My suit screamed warnings as pressure spikes crashed through the supports. I slammed every shutoff I could reach, but the gas had already filled the dead spaces. The hollow cavities behind panels where dust and old insulation sat. Something sparked, maybe from a drone, maybe from a cheap lamp, maybe from my own cutter. The explosion did not feel like fire. It felt like the universe coughing. The tunnel turned into a hammer hitting from all directions. My helmet slammed against the wall. For a moment, there was no sound at all. Then the world came back as a high-pitched whine and the taste of blood in my mouth. The blast wave went racing down connected conduits, up lift shafts, into adjacent domes. In some of those spaces, workers still moved. Security still searched. They had not expected the world itself to weaponize against them. Sections of Keth 9 that had stood for 20 years tore like old canvas. Later, I would hear, in the fragments of surviving logs, the casualty estimates. Numbers of bodies, domes partially vented, names in lists. In the moment, all I knew was that I was lying in the dark, pinned under a twisted segment of pipe, with alarms keening in a dozen registers and the suit's structural integrity readout flashing red. The air smelled of burned polymer and something sweet and wrong. I pushed against the pipe. My left arm responded. My right sent back pain like a white flare. I freed myself a centimeter at a time, grinding bruised ribs against cold metal, until I could drag my body out into a marginally clearer space. The HUD showed hairline fractures in my helmet, but no leaks yet. Oxygen reserve down by 1/3. Suit power flickering. External temperature dropping as the tunnel bled heat. I listened. No boots. No voices, only the distant sound of things collapsing filtered through the ice. I had not meant to do this. I had wanted only enough disruption to slip the net. Instead, I had torn a chunk out of the colony and everyone inside it. The realization did not hit with guilt. Guilt requires a belief that another path was truly open to you. I was not sure that was true. The system had stacked its weight on one side of the scale for years. All I had added was my own, in the only language it had ever acknowledged from me. The tactical situation had changed, that was all. The old security units could not handle this. They did not have the training for mass casualty incident layered over an active hostile. The corporation would not trust them to, even if they thought they could. There would be a call-up chain, a request for specialized intervention. Who they sent would be closer to what I used to be. I swatted that assumption into my mental map and moved. The deeper under-ice levels were now full of unstable tunnels and voids. Fire had eaten oxygen in strange patterns. Some passages were still pressurized, others vented to raw ice. Sensors would be unreliable. Drones would crash or misread. That cut both ways. It made hunting me harder. It made surviving down here harder too. I headed toward the emergency ascent shaft that connected directly to the base of the central extractor tower. It was a long route, along service spines and through inspection pockets, some of them only wide enough to crawl. My right shoulder screamed each time I pulled with that arm, so I began saving it, favoring my left, feeling my body's geometry shift around the injury. Time blurred into a sequence of metal and ice and breath. Somewhere above, the off-world team arrived. You could tell by the difference in how they stepped and spoke. Their boots had more weight in them, not from mass, but from intention. Their radio traffic was sparser, more coded, less emotional. They did not curse when things went wrong. They adjusted. Their drones flew in more careful patterns, overlapping fields of view, probing small spaces before committing. One of their operators must have parsed the blast signature from Junction L and compared it to known patterns. Shaped charges versus sudden overpressure. Intentional sabotage versus internal failure. Either way, they would have realized that whoever was down here with them understood systems as well as gunfights. They began venting sections. At first, it was individual pockets, small and surgical. They would detect residual gas, open valves to space, let vacuum strip the hazard. Anyone hiding there would be frozen and broken along with it. Then they widened the pattern. Larger segments of level 3 under the ice went gray on my HUD as life support cut out. Temperature dropped, pressure dropped, airflow indicators went flat. They were not trying to flush me from a building. They were redesigning the battlefield. I reached the lip of the emergency ascent shaft with air reserves low and suit power edging toward the point where exo assist would fail. The shaft was a vertical cylinder carved through layers of ice and reinforced with metal rings, a straight climb toward the underside of the tower. In safer days, a lift cage would ride the track in the center. Now the cage hung motionless 3 levels up, stuck between safety override locks. I looked up. The shaft rose into darkness. Crystals of ice flashed in the occasional emergency light flicker like slow-falling sparks. Climbing it with one bad arm and reduced power would be slow. Staying down here would be slower in a different way. Above me, faintly through metal and ice, I heard the distant heavy hum of the extractor tower's main pumps. They were still running. Production had not fully stopped yet. The corporation always tried to keep them running as long as possible, no matter what burned around them. If I wanted leverage, that was where it sat. I clipped my harness to the track, calibrated my suit's remaining assist to favor the left leg, and started climbing. Every rung was a count. 10 for the pain in the shoulder, 20 for the memory of a similar shaft on another world when I had climbed out of a burning bunker while artillery walked across the hillside above, 30 for the people I had left behind, then and now. Halfway up, the shaft shook. Not gently, not like a tremor. This was a shudder from something massive adjusting its weight. Ice rained down in a fine mist of crystals. One of the reinforcement rings groaned, metal complaining in a long, low note. My HUD flashed a structural stress warning tied to the tower's support struts. The explosion at Junction L had not just blown tunnels. The damage spidered upward into the lattice holding the extractor in place. The whole assembly was now off balance, a giant needle driven into the ice at the wrong angle. Above, someone cycled a bulkhead. Pressure equalized with a sigh like a dying animal. I climbed faster until my arms shook. At the top of the shaft, I found a service platform ringed by consoles and thick cables just under the main base of the extractor tower. Vibrations from the pumps thrummed through the metal, a deep, relentless heartbeat. Warning lights blinked in angry patterns across control panels, flagging misalignments and overloads and ignored shutdown requests. A hatch opened off the platform into a narrow corridor leading towards central control. I could hear boots in there, heavy and measured. Voices filtered faintly through the wall, filtered by metal and ice. Not words, just cadence. They were close enough now that I could feel their presence like pressure. I could have tried to bypass them entirely, seeking another route to the exterior. But the surface was not safety. It was lethal cold and blind wind. Without leverage, all escape meant was dying slower in the storm. Leverage was here. I moved along the platform to the main pump manifold. Thick pipes converged from below, feeding into the tower's vertical conduits. Manual override levers lined each connection. Motor housings thrummed with power. Safety systems glowed in dormant reds and greens. I had spent enough time in war-torn infrastructure to know what would happen if I broke these in the right way. Cut power and the pumps would slow, creating pressure waves back downline, triggering automatic seals and, eventually, a cascade shutdown. Damage, but controllable. Overload them while partially constricting flows, and you could generate enough stress to crack mounts, twist supports, and send vibrations through the whole tower. In an already weakened structure, that could be enough to bring parts of it down. I did not need it to fall entirely. I just needed it to hurt enough that evacuation became the only option left. The ethics of it did not enter into it. Ethics were for men not already designated as hostile and crippled asset in some distant executive's file view. I used the multi-cutter and my remaining strength to jam safeties, cut control lines, and cross-link override circuits in patterns no sane engineer would tolerate. The tower's status lights shifted from alert to alarm to something beyond alarm, a furious flicker of conflicting signals. The pump sound climbed, went rough at the edges as bearings fought distortion. The deck started to vibrate with a new, unhealthy rhythm. In the corridor, the boots accelerated. They came into view at the hatch, 3 of them in matte black exo armor with minimal markings. No company crest, just a small alphanumeric code near the collar. Their rifles were compact and ugly, muzzles designed for interchangeable loads. Their helmets bore extra optics clusters and sensor nodes. They moved like men who had practiced in tight spaces, covering arcs cleanly, weapons disciplined. No wasted motion. They saw me, weapons angled. They did not shout. One of them gestured once, small flick of 2 fingers, and the others adjusted positions. Our eyes met across the platform, visor to visor. I saw recognition in the way the lead man's stance shifted, not of me as a person, of my posture. The way I stood beside the manifold, tools in hand, cables cut in deliberate patterns. He had seen similar scenes before in other structures, on other worlds, created by men like him and me. He raised his rifle a fraction and took a step forward. His free hand made another small movement. I recognized the signal. Hold fire. Attempt capture if possible. They wanted me alive, either for information or example. The deck under my feet shook harder. A grinding roar built somewhere inside the tower as something massive shifted. A deep structural alarm began pulsing in the walls, so low I felt it more than heard it. On my HUD, a new prompt blinked. Tower integrity threshold exceeded. Evacuation recommended. I walked backward toward the outer access hatch that led to the surface. They advanced to maintain distance, careful, professional, matching my pace. We were all bound together now, not by orders, but by physics. The first failure came as a long, tearing crack from below. The entire platform dropped half a centimeter and slammed back up. One of the console mounts sheared off, bolts snapping in a spray of metal. A cable bundle whipped free and lashed across the space we had just occupied. The off-world men shifted weight automatically, stabilizing. No panic. My respect for them increased on a purely technical level. Another alarm joined the first. This one had a different tone. I did not know its exact code, but I understood the message. Something fundamental had let go. Part of me, the part drilled down to act in unit terms, wanted to warn them, coordinate, find a way out together. Old habits of brotherhood do not die clean, they rot. I turned away instead and keyed the outer hatch. Cold hit, like a physical blow when it opened. The atmosphere outside was barely dense enough to call air. The wind carried particles of ice and hydrocarbon dust that scoured any exposed surface. The gas giant dominated the sky, a swollen blue-green curve streaked with storms. My suit systems screamed at me about temperature, pressure, wind speed. I acknowledged none of it. Numbers are just another flavor of fear. I stepped onto the exterior maintenance gantry, a narrow walkway bolted along the underside of the tower, leading out into the storm. Behind me, partial gravity shifts, and the distant, grinding scream of metal marked the beginning of the tower's collapse. The off-world team had a choice. Continue pursuit into a storm that would strip their sensors and eat their armor, or retreat to secure internal positions and hope the structure held long enough. They chose the rational one. Footsteps receded. Inner hatch slammed shut. Faint, muffled through my suit, I heard the thud of lockdown bolts engaging. I was alone with the wind and the failing tower. The gantry swayed as the entire assembly above shifted. I moved forward with one hand on the rail, boots magnetized to the metal to keep purchase. The storm tried to push me sideways, to peel me off into the abyss. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The world reduced to blowing white grit and shards of ice that pinged against my helmet. My oxygen reserve dropped below a quarter. Suit power, drained by heating and exo assist, crept toward critical. I followed the gantry until it ended at a small emergency shelter bulge in the tower's underside, barely more than a reinforced dome with a hatch and a blinking status light. It had no life support of its own, just the tie into the main system. The main system was dying. I did not go inside. A place like that would become a tomb when the tower finally broke. Instead, I eased myself down into the shadow of its base, wedging my body into the angle where gantry and tower met. The structure here was thick, giving me some shelter from the wind's direct fury. From this position, I could see the colony spread out below, dim through the storm. Hab domes glowed faintly through the blowing ice. Some were dark, others flickered with emergency power. Air vents jetted plumes of white as the system tried to compensate for damaged sections. Further out, near the edge of the platform, a cluster of evacuation craft lifted, their thrusters carving brief tunnels of clarity in the haze. Tiny, isolated points of light moving away from the wounded rock. I watched them rise without feeling triumph or regret. They were just more moving lights in a universe of moving lights. Some carried people who had laughed when security dragged me through the dome. Some carried people who had fixed pipes beside me for months. All of them were variables I could no longer influence. The extractor tower groaned beneath me. Somewhere above, a major support finally failed. The sound came down through the metal, a deep, grinding roar that turned into a juddering, intervaled crash. The tower shifted several degrees, the gantry tilted. My body slid until my boots caught a protrusion. Alarms on my HUD went from insistent to resigned. Structural integrity compromised, orientation unstable, life support failing. It felt familiar. I lay there, strapped to the underside of a dying machine on an airless moon, and thought about the chair in the decon room, about the other chair on the other world under other lights, about every small moment when someone had placed a hand on the back of my neck as if I were a piece of equipment to be positioned. They had wanted to move me, to recycle me out of their clean little system. I had refused. This was the result. I do not know how many died because I would not sit in that chair again. I do not know how many would have died later in other wars if the system had remained intact to feed them into the grinder. Numbers are for analysts, far from the smell of burned polymer. All I know is that Keth 9 is quiet now, or will be soon. The reports will call it an industrial accident aggravated by hostile action from a deranged ex-combatant. The corporate channels will debate compensation ratios and liability. Somewhere, a board will decide whether to rebuild or abandon. The men they sent for me will move on to the next contract. They will remember this as a messy job with too much infrastructure risk. Maybe one of them will replay the helmet recordings and listen to this. If so, then this is my debrief. I was trained to drop from orbit into someone else's sky and break their resistance until the map matched what my employers wanted. I did that until my joints ached and my mind frayed. When they were finished, they tried to file me away like a broken tool. They forgot that tools wear down in the shape of their work. My shape does not fit in chairs and domes and evaluation rooms. It fits in shafts and gantries and places where metal meets ice, where systems strain and fail. The wind has worked a thin layer of frozen dust over my visor now. The stars are a muted smear beyond it. The gas giant's bands flicker as if seen through water. My breath sounds louder than the storm. In, out. Sue heaters are fading. Cold is crawling up my limbs in slow, patient increments. My fingers are numb on the rail. My shoulder has stopped hurting. That means the nerves are surrendering. There is no extraction coming. No friendly beacon threading down through the atmosphere. No voice over comms calling me by rank and number and telling me to hold on a little longer. There is only this. I find that I do not mind. The last image I hold, deliberately, is not the decon frame or the torture chair or the faces of any man I have killed. It is the moment just before the storm swallowed the evacuation craft, when their engines cut a clear path through the white and revealed, for a heartbeat, the raw black of space behind them. A hole in the storm, a clean absence. The tower groans one last time. The gantry lurches. My grip loosens. The HUD flickers, then goes dark. I keep breathing until I can't. The end. The narrative settles, and the world returns to a fortified, peaceful quiet. You're in the safest part of the night now. Let sleep take over.